A new report suggests federal and provincial politicians have only been able to point to a handful of examples where removing red tape between the provinces can have an impact. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is dismissing moves by the federal government and the premiers to break down internal trade barriers as little more than political theater. Our contributor David Clement has more on the report.
The idea that interprovincial trade barriers are choking Canada's economy has gripped politicians, media, and the public. Premiers and the federal government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, have made dismantling these barriers a priority, especially amid U.S. tariff threats.
The coming weeks and months will be critical, really, to turn the momentum that's been created by you around this table, that the federal government is looking to add to translate that momentum, those ideas into action. But I'm very confident with the experience, the expertise, the goodwill, and the support of Canadians that we will do just that.
Bills like the federal Bill C5 and provincial legislation in places like Ontario, BC, and PEI aim to ease trade and labor mobility with promises of boosting Canadian GDP by up to 7%. But here's the twist. According to a new report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, these so-called trade irritants have been vastly overstated. In their view, most goods, services, and investments already flow freely across provincial borders. They claim that the studies showing massive economic losses as a result of these barriers are deeply flawed and have questioned their methodology. So, according to the authors, they say, why the rush? They suggest the move is more about politics than economics. Premiers are framing this as a patriotic response to external pressures like U.S. tariffs, but the study and its authors warn that this race to remove barriers could have downsides. Harmonizing regulations, according to its authors, could weaken standards in critical areas like health, workplace safety, or environmental protections in what they call a potential race to the bottom. The report also highlights that provinces like Quebec and Newfoundland are hesitant to fully jump on board, citing unique economic challenges. While the federal government claims it's eliminated all of its exemptions, many experts have pointed out that where most barriers lie is with these provincial rules, which remain a sticking point.
We're now going to bring in David Clement from the Consumer Choice Center for more on the actual cost of these barriers. David, what do you make of the report's claims that the gains from harmonization are overstated?
So it's important to highlight that this really goes against all of the evidence we've seen from numerous bodies. So we're talking the IMF in 2019, the Macdonald Laurier Institute, the Royal Bank of Canada, the Canadian Federation for Independent Businesses, Statistics Canada. We're even looking at polling from Canadian businesses who've cited time and time again that it's harder to do business within Canada than it is to export. And so I find the claims from the Center for Policy Alternatives concerning because they are essentially coming at the 11th hour when we have all of this momentum to tear down these barriers to try and have one country and one market, and trying to wag their finger at all of the evidence that's already presented. And it's important to note that this isn't just, let's say, center-right think tank research that's generally going to lean pro-free trade. We're talking about, one, institutions who are government institutions like Statistics Canada, and two, the IMF, who really have no skin in the game per se. They have no ideological bent where they may lean one way in their research versus another. And so I find their push now at the 11th hour, while we're nearing the end of interprovincial trade barriers, to be kind of stale and old, tired arguments against free trade.
Well, what about the report's view that harmonizing regulations creates a race to the bottom? What do you make of that?
This is ridiculous. So it rests on the premise that one province is so deregulatory that it would somehow risk the safety of residents in another province. And there is not a single Canadian who is out there who's going to say a nurse who's trained and practiced in Quebec or Prince Edward Island is not suitable to train or practice in Ontario or Manitoba or what have you. And so again, this is just this really stale, outdated argument against free trade. And what's ironic in the report is the report highlights the costs of Donald Trump's tariffs. So there's an implicit agreement that tariffs are bad and tariffs have a cost and we need to avoid tariffs, while at the same time, they're perpetuating the argument that, well, you know what, maybe these internal trade barriers, which are essentially tariffs, are not so bad. And I think what it really boils down to is you have several vested interests who have skin in the game, who do not want competition, who do not want labor mobility across provinces. And that is where this kind of viewpoint comes from. But you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say that Donald Trump's tariffs are bad and unjust while also at the same time defending barriers to labor mobility and the transfer of goods within Canada. Either tariffs are good, and I think the economic evidence suggests that that's a philosophy from the early 1900s that failed, or they're bad. And if they're bad, we're one country, we're one market. There's no reasonable explanation or justification to say something made in Newfoundland isn't suitable for New Brunswick or something made in Ontario isn't suitable for Alberta. So it just feels like the the historical argument against free trade played over and over and over and over again, and it's just incredibly dated, and it's disappointing because you want to see think tanks put out serious research that are tackling the problems that Canadians face, and even if you take their claims at face value, right? So they cite a 1990 report that says reducing trade barriers would increase GDP by 1%, so significantly less than 7%. Let's say that's accurate. If that's accurate, what does a 1% increase in GDP mean for Canada?
Mm.
Well, that likely means we avoid a recession. Who watching this, who out there in Canada would advocate against a policy that could potentially mean that the Canadian economy avoids a recession? And so that is really, even if you take their skewed perspective, at 1%, it still helps us avoid a recession. And that is obviously a good thing.
Well, is there any merit in their argument that it's really up to the provinces to get rid of their barrier as opposed to the federal government getting them out of the way?
Yes. So there is merit there.
Mm.
I was on the Canadian Free Trade Agreements Reconciliatory Board, the board that tried to hash out all of these issues. I've been very critical of that process. It was very slow. They picked easy targets in terms of things that they could pick away at. Didn't really get to the substantial change that we need. So yeah, it is provinces who bear the burden here because it's ultimately the provinces who make these rules. Now, there are federal examples. Ottawa has said they've gotten out of the way. That's a step in the right direction. But ultimately, it is either up to the provinces to figure this out amongst themselves, or it's up to Ottawa to do something drastic and force that change upon the provinces. And it is important to note that this could have actually been done years ago. There was a case, the Como case went to the Supreme Court over beer. If the federal government had intervened and that individual had won that case, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. The New Brunswick government fought an old man for driving beer across the border from Quebec over interprovincial trade barriers. If they hadn't have done that, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. And so, yes, there is some merit that the provinces are to blame, but it doesn't mean the federal government can't play a role, and it doesn't mean that there's not more work to be done.
Mhm. We do have about a minute left, but what's your take on the MOU signed between Alberta and Ontario yesterday? Would that be progress? Progress in the right direction?
I think it's progress, but I think We're in the rubber hits the road territory where, I mean, memorandums of understanding and promises to do a study and feasibility and all of these fluffy government words leave people wondering, okay, well, are you actually going to do something about it? And
Mhm.
that would be my concern is that, and this is where maybe the center is correct, is that it's political theater, but not political theater because interprovincial trade barriers don't matter. It's political theater because the provinces aren't actually going to do what it takes to get this across in and score a touchdown, to use a football analogy. And so it's progress. Is it enough? No, but it's a step in the right direction.
Well, David, thank you for the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.